There are discoveries in this world that don't behave the way history says they should. Objects that look human, but aren't quite right. Tools that were made, but never meant to be used. Cities that didn't fall, but simply faded away. Across deserts, buried beneath ash, hidden under water and carved deep into stone, we keep finding traces of something that doesn't fully fit the story we've been told. These aren't myths, and still, not fully explained. In this video, we're walking through a series of real ancient discoveries, from impossible skull shapes to forgotten cities frozen in time, to structures aligned with the sky thousands of years before recorded history. If that kind of mystery pulls you in, you're not alone. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? It's something we're still trying to understand. The footprints that challenge what we thought came first, Paluxy River. In a quiet stretch of land in Texas, where a river cuts through layers of ancient rock, there are marks that don't immediately seem unusual. At first, they appear as impressions. Shallow, irregular, part of the stone surface. But as the water level drops, and the rock becomes fully visible, the shapes begin to stand out. This is the Paluxy River, and embedded within its limestone bed are tracks, preserved in stone, formed in a time long before the modern landscape existed. These tracks are not random. They follow paths, sequences, lines that suggest movement, and that movement matters because it indicates direction. Some of these tracks resemble those of known prehistoric animals. Large, rounded impressions, spacing consistent with the stride of dinosaurs, and those tracks fit within established understanding. They align with what is known. They confirm patterns already studied, but among them, there are others, different in shape, different in proportion, longer, narrower, with what appears to be a defined heel and forward extension. And that is where the uncertainty begins. Because some have interpreted these as human-like footprints, and if that interpretation were fully confirmed, it would create a contradiction. Because the rock in which these tracks are preserved dates back to a period long before humans are believed to have existed, and that gap is not small. It spans millions of years, which means that the presence of human-like tracks in that layer would not fit within the current timeline. But interpretation is not simple, because stone changes. Over time, impressions can erode, edges soften, shapes distort. What may have once been clear can become ambiguous, and that ambiguity is central to this site. Some researchers argue that the human-like shapes are not human at all, that they are dinosaur tracks that have been altered, erosion removing details, changing the appearance, making them seem more familiar than they actually are. Others suggest that some tracks may have been misidentified entirely, natural formations mistaken for footprints, patterns in stone interpreted as intentional, and that possibility adds complexity, because it introduces error, not in the formation, but in the interpretation. The conditions that preserve these tracks are specific. Soft sediment that captured impressions, later hardened into limestone, protecting the shapes over time, and that preservation is what allows them to be seen today. But it also means that what we see is not the original form exactly. It is the result of time acting on that form, which complicates understanding. The arrangement of the track suggests movement across a surface, paths that intersect, lines that run parallel in some areas, indicating that multiple creatures move through the same space, at different times, or possibly at the same time. And that overlap adds another layer, because it creates interaction, not direct evidence of interaction, but shared space. The scale of the tracks varies, some large, others smaller, which suggests different sizes of creatures, different types, different movements. The human-like tracks, if interpreted that way, do not always appear in long, consistent sequences. Some are isolated, others incomplete, which makes confirmation difficult, because a clear pattern is easier to identify than scattered impressions. The debate surrounding these tracks has continued for decades. Arguments presented, evidence examined, reinterpretations made as new information becomes available. And still, no single conclusion fully resolves every detail, because each explanation addresses part of the evidence, but not all of it. The scientific approach tends to favour explanations that align with established timelines, which means that interpretations involving non-human origins are often considered more consistent. But the visual similarity remains, and that similarity is what continues to draw attention, because perception plays a role. What looks human feels human, even when it may not be, and that tension between appearance and explanation defines the site. Even now, the tracks remain, exposed when conditions allow, hidden when water levels rise, appearing and disappearing over time, which adds another layer of change, because the site itself is not constant. What defines the Palaxy River tracks is not certainty, but conflict between interpretation and expectation, a set of impressions that fit within known patterns, and others that seem to challenge them, not fully outside understanding, but not completely inside it either. And maybe that is what makes this site stand out, not because it provides a clear answer, but because it raises a question that is difficult to ignore, a pattern in stone, a sequence of movement preserved across time, shapes that suggest something familiar, in a place where it should not appear, and that possibility. The shape that shouldn't exist. At first glance, it looks almost human, familiar enough to recognize, but different enough to make you pause. The face is there, the structure is there, but something about the proportions feels wrong in a way that is difficult to immediately explain. The skull extends far beyond what we expect, not slightly bumpy, but noticeably elongated, stretched backward in a smooth, controlled curve, and the longer you look at it, the more unsettling it becomes, because this is not a random distortion. It is not damage. It is not erosion. This shape was created, and that realization changes everything. These elongated skull artifacts have been discovered in multiple regions across the world, not in one isolated location, but in places separated by vast distances. South America, parts of Africa, even regions of Eurasia. Different cultures, different timelines, and yet the same form appears. That alone raises a question that is difficult to ignore, because when something repeats across cultures that had no direct connection, it suggests something deeper than coincidence. The structure of these skulls is what draws attention first. The cranial vault extends backward in a way that increases volume. The forehead slopes differently. The back of the skull forms a longer arc than what is typically seen in natural human development, and yet the facial features remain mostly proportionate. Eyes positioned normally, jaw aligned, nasal structure intact, which creates a strange contrast. Part of the form feels human. The other part does not fully match that expectation. In some cases, archaeologists have linked this to a known cultural practice, intentional cranial modification, a process that begins in infancy when the skull is still soft and capable of being shaped over time. Using bindings, cloth wraps, wooden boards, pressure is applied gradually, not suddenly, not forcefully, but consistently and over months or even years, guiding the growth of the skull into a different shape. This explanation provides part of the answer. It shows that humans had the ability to alter skull shape intentionally. It explains how some of these forms could have been created, but it does not explain everything, because some skulls appear too symmetrical, too consistent in proportion, almost as if the final result was not just guided, but precisely intended. And that precision introduces doubt. The artifacts themselves, those made of clay or stone, mirror these shapes. They are not rough representations. They are detailed, carefully formed, smoothed along the surface, balanced in structure, each curve intentional, each angle considered, which suggests that these were not casual objects. They carried meaning. The effort required to create these artifacts is not insignificant. Material had to be gathered, shaped, refined, and that process takes time that would not be spent without purpose, which means these forms were important enough to preserve, important enough to recreate, important enough to pass down. The repetition of elongated skull imagery across regions adds another layer. Because even when the exact techniques differ, the idea remains: a stretched form, an extended cranium, a shape that moves beyond natural expectation. And that consistency suggests that this was not just a local practice, it was a shared concept. The purpose behind it remains unclear. Some interpretations suggest status, that individuals with altered skulls were seen as different, elevated in some way. Leaders, spiritual figures, members of a higher social group, the shape itself becoming a marker of identity. Other interpretations suggest something more symbolic, an attempt to resemble something else, not just a human form, but a modified version of it, possibly connected to belief systems, to representations of beings that were considered important, powerful, or other. And that possibility shifts the meaning entirely, because then the question becomes, were these shapes purely cultural, or were they influenced by something that people believed they had seen, something they tried to imitate? The variation between skulls adds complexity to this idea. Some are slightly elongated, others are extreme, extending far beyond what would seem practical or even comfortable. And yet, they exist, preserved, documented, still visible today. The biological implications also raise questions, because altering skull shape affects structure, bone growth, internal space, and yet many of these individuals lived long enough for the shape to fully develop, which suggests adaptation, that the body adjusted, or that the process was controlled carefully enough to avoid harm. The artifacts made in clay and stone act as a kind of record, not of individuals, but of the idea itself, a way of preserving the form beyond a single generation, ensuring that the shape would continue to exist even after the people themselves were gone. And that preservation matters, because it allows the pattern to be studied, compared, analysed, not just as isolated objects, but as part of a larger system of meaning. Even now, these elongated forms continue to appear in discussions, research, and debate, because they do not fully settle into a single explanation. They exist between understanding and uncertainty, partially explained, but not completely. What makes them so compelling is not just how they look, it is how consistent they are. Across distance, across time, a form that appears where it should not logically repeat, and yet does. Not random, not accidental, but intentional, without a single clear reason that explains all of it. A human shape modified beyond expectation, repeated across cultures, preserved in material, and that is what makes it difficult to ignore. Art beyond human form. At first, it doesn't look like anything familiar. Not clearly human, not clearly animal, just a shape formed with intention. And yet, the longer you look at it, the more it feels like it's trying to represent something. But what that something is never fully becomes clear. These are prehistoric figurines, small in size, often carved from stone to bone or clay, objects that were shaped thousands of years ago and somehow still exist today, preserved, studied, displayed, but not fully understood. Unlike later forms of art, these figures do not always follow realistic proportions. They don't aim for accuracy. They don't try to replicate the human body in a way that matches observation. Instead, they simplify, or exaggerate, or distort, creating forms that feel abstract, yet intentional. Some figurines have exaggerated features, enlarged hips, rounded forms, simplified faces, tails reduced, while certain elements are emphasized. And that selective focus suggests meaning, because when something is exaggerated, it is rarely accidental. It is chosen. Other figurines move even further away from realism. Limbs that are barely defined. Faces that are almost featureless. Bodies that appear more like symbols than representations. And that shift is important, because it shows that the goal was not to recreate reality. It was to express something else. The materials used vary depending on the region. Clay shaped by hand, stone carved with tools, bone refined into small forms. Each material requires a different process, different techniques, different levels of effort, and that variation reflects adaptability, because the idea of the figurine existed even when the materials changed. The size of these objects is often small, designed to be held, carried, placed in specific locations, which suggests that they were not just decorative. They had a role, something personal, something functional, or something symbolic. The repetition of abstract forms across different regions adds another layer, because similar styles appear in places that were not directly connected. Different cultures, different timelines, yet similar simplifications, similar exaggerations, and that repetition suggests a shared way of thinking. The purpose of these figurines is not fully defined. Some interpretations suggest they represent fertility, the exaggerated forms connected to life, growth, continuation. Others suggest spiritual or meaning, objects used in rituals, symbols of belief, and some suggest they were simply expressions, early attempts at representing ideas rather than physical reality. But none of these explanations fully cover every example, because the forms vary too much. Some are detailed, some are minimal, some feel intentional in their distortion, others feel almost unfinished, and that inconsistency makes a single explanation difficult. The process of creating these figurines would have required time, shaping, carving, refining the surface. Even when the final form appears simple, the process behind it is not, and that effort reflects importance, because time was invested into something that was meant to last. The surfaces of these objects often show signs of wear, handling, movement, contact over time, which suggests that they were used, not just created and left behind, but interacted with, held, moved, possibly passed from one person to another. The abstraction itself is what makes these objects stand out, because it moves away from imitation and into interpretation. Instead of showing exactly what something looks like, it shows what it represents, or what it means. And that shift is significant, because it suggests a different way of thinking, not focused only on physical reality, but on ideas, concepts, symbols. The preservation of these figurines allows them to exist far beyond their original context, separated from the people who created them, removed from the environments they were part of, leaving only the object itself and the shape it carries. Even now they continue to be studied, measured, compared, placed within timelines, but still not fully explained, because understanding the form is easier than understanding the intention behind it. What makes these figurines so compelling is not just their age, it is their abstraction, their refusal to fully explain themselves, their ability to suggest meanings without confirming it. They are not exact, not realistic, but they are not random either. They exist somewhere in between form and idea, between representation and interpretation, and maybe that is what defines them. Not what they show, but what they imply. A shape that moves beyond the human form, an object that represents more than what can be seen, a design that carries meaning without revealing it completely. Art that does not try to copy reality, but instead redefines it. The giant tool no one could use. At first glance it looks familiar. A tool, simple in form, recognizable in purpose, but then the scale begins to register. It's too large, not slightly oversized, but far beyond what would comfortably fit in a human hand. And that changes everything. This is a giant hand axe, discovered in Kent, England, carved from stone, shaped with precision, and preserved across an immense stretch of time. At a distance it resembles other tools from the same period. Sharp edges, a tapered point, a base that suggests where it might have been held. But as soon as you compare it to typical examples, the difference becomes impossible to ignore. Most hand axes were made to be used directly, held in the palm, balanced, controlled, designed for cutting, scraping, shaping materials, tools that fit the hand naturally. But this one does not. It exceeds that scale, and that raises a simple question. Who was it made for? The craftsmanship is clear. The edges are shaped deliberately, the surface refined through repeated strikes. This is not a rough stone, it has been worked, carefully, with intention, and that level of effort suggests that its size was not an accident. The process of creating a hand axe requires skill, stone selected for its properties, struck in controlled ways to remove flakes, each strike shaping the form, gradually refining the edges into something sharp and functional, and that process becomes more difficult as the size increases. Because larger tools are harder to control, harder to shape evenly, harder to finish with precision. Yet this object was completed, not partially shaped, not abandoned midway, but finished, which suggests that the maker knew exactly what they were doing, and that the size was intentional from the beginning. The weight of the tool would have made it difficult to use in the same way as smaller hand axes. Too heavy for repeated motion, too large for fine control, which creates a contradiction, because it looks like a tool, but does not behave like one. This contradiction is what defines the object. Form suggests function, but scale challenges it, and when those two things don't align, the meaning becomes uncertain. Some interpretations suggest that it may not have been used in the traditional sense, that it could have served a different purpose, a symbolic object, a display piece, something created to represent skill rather than perform a task, because creating something larger than necessary often carries meaning beyond utility. It becomes a statement of ability, of control, of intention. Other interpretations suggest that it may have had a specific function that is no longer obvious, a use that does not translate easily into modern understanding. Because tools are shaped by context, and without that context, their purpose can become unclear. The location of the discovery adds another layer, because it was found among other artifacts, objects that were clearly functional, clearly used, which makes the presence of this oversized tool even more unusual. It does not match the pattern completely. It stands apart, not separate enough to be unrelated, but different enough to raise questions. The surface of the tool shows signs of wear, indicating that it was handled, moved, possibly used in some way, but not necessarily in the same way as smaller hand axes, and that distinction matters, because it suggests that the object had a role, even if that role is not fully understood today. The scale also changes how the object is perceived visually, because when something familiar is enlarged beyond expectation, it begins to feel unfamiliar. Even when its form remains the same, this effect creates tension between recognition and confusion. You know what it's supposed to be, but it doesn't behave the way it should. The preservation of the tool allows it to remain visible today, a single object, carrying its shape across the thousands of years, unchanged, still holding the same question. Why make a tool that cannot be used easily? Even now it remains part of ongoing discussion, examined, compared, placed within the broader context of prehistoric tools, but never fully resolved. Because while we understand how it was made, we do not fully understand why it was made this way, and that difference is important, because knowing the process is not the same as knowing the intention. What makes this object stand out is not just its size, it is the gap between expectation and reality, a tool that looks functional, but challenges its own purpose, a form that suggests use, but resists it, an object that fits within an own category, yet does not fully belong. And maybe that is what defines it, not what it is, but what it disrupts. A familiar shape expanded beyond necessity, a tool that no one could easily use, and that question, the city that disappeared beneath ash at Krateri. At first it looks like a preserved moment, not ruins in the usual sense, not collapsed into fragments, but paused, as if time moved forward and the city didn't. This is Krateri, a settlement on the island of Santorini, buried beneath layers of volcanic ash thousands of years ago. And what makes it different is not just its destruction, but its preservation. The structures remain, walls still standing, rooms still defined, pathways that still guide movement through the space. Unlike many ancient sites where time reduces everything to scattered stone, here the layout is still visible, almost intact. The reason lies in the eruption, a volcanic event powerful enough to cover the entire settlement in ash, layer by layer, sealing it, protecting it from erosion, from weather, from the gradual loss that affects most ancient places. But that same event also ended the life of the city, abruptly, without warning that could fully prepare its inhabitants. And that contrast defines Krateri, preserved because it was destroyed. The buildings themselves reveal a level of development that feels advanced for its time. Multi-story structures, stone and plaster walls, rooms arranged with intention, not random placement, but planned space. The interiors show signs of daily life, storage areas, living spaces, objects left behind, not because they were abandoned slowly, but because there was no time to take them. The walls are what draw attention next, painted surfaces, frescoes that still carry colour, scenes that show movement, people, environments, images that provide a glimpse into how the inhabitants saw their world. And that matters, because most ancient sites lose this level of detail. The colour fades, the surfaces erode, but here, the ash preserved it. The layout of the city suggests organisation. Streets that connect structures, open spaces that allow movement, a system that feels functional, designed. This was not a temporary settlement. It was established, developed over time, built with the expectation of continuity, and that expectation was interrupted. The absence of human remains is one of the most unusual aspects of the site, because in many similar events, evidence of inhabitants is found within the ruins, but here, that evidence is limited, which suggests that many may have left before the final eruption, that there was some warning, some indication that it allowed escape. But even if people left, the city itself remained. Frozen in the moment it was covered, the ash acted as a barrier, protecting the structures from collapse, preserving details that would normally disappear over time, creating a layer between past and present, and when that layer was eventually uncovered, what emerged was not just ruins, but a snapshot, a place that still holds its shape, still shows how space was used, still reflects the choices of the people who built it. The scale of Akrotiri adds to its impact. Because this is not a single structure. It is an entire settlement. Multiple buildings, connected spaces, a system that functioned as a whole, and that scale makes the preservation even more significant, because it allows the site to be understood not just as isolated pieces, but as a complete environment. The materials used in construction also contribute to its survival. Stone, plaster, combined in ways that allowed the structures to maintain their form even under the weight of ash. The positioning of objects within the site adds another layer, because they remain where they were left, not rearranged, not relocated, but in place, which creates a sense of immediacy, as if the space could still be used, as if the interruption was recent, even though it was thousands of years ago. The relationship between destruction and preservation is what defines this site, because without the eruption, the city would likely have changed, expanded, evolved, or been lost in other ways. But instead, it was sealed, held in place. Even now, Akrotiri remains one of the clearest examples of how an ancient city once existed, not imagined, but visible. The walls still stand, the rooms still connect, the details still remain, and that is what makes it different. Not just a site of ruins, but a preserved moment, a city that did not slowly fade, but stopped, a place where time moved forward, but the structures stayed behind. And maybe that is what makes Akrotiri so powerful, not just because it was lost, but because it was kept, held beneath ash, protected by destruction, a complete city, waiting to be seen again, the canyon where light moves like a structure, Antelope Canyon. At first it feels like a narrow passage, not a vast landscape, not an open space, but a confined path, carved into the earth. Walls rising on both sides, close, curving, and as you move deeper, the light begins to change. This is Antelope Canyon, located in Arizona, shaped over time by water moving through stone, gradually carving out a space that does not follow straight lines or sharp edges. Instead, everything flows. The walls are smooth, not rough like typical rock formations, but polished by erosion, shaped into curves that bend and twist in ways that feel almost deliberate, as if the canyon was sculpted rather than formed. The sandstone creates a surface that reflects light differently throughout the day, soft tones shifting from orange to red to deeper shades depending on how the light enters, and that variation transforms the space, because the canyon does not look the same at every moment. The most defining feature is the light itself, because at certain times beams of sunlight pass through the narrow openings above and enter the canyon as visible columns. Not scattered light, but defined shafts, almost solid in appearance. These beams move slowly, changing position as the sun shifts, creating patterns that do not remain fixed, and that movement adds a sense of time to the space, because the canyon is not static, it changes, even without movement from the viewer. The formation of the canyon is the result of water erosion over long periods. Flash floods moving through narrow gaps, carrying sediment, gradually shaping the stone, smoothing edges, deepening pathways, and that process leaves behind more than just a passage. It creates a structure, not built, but formed through repetition, through pressure applied over time. The curves of the canyon walls guide movement, not in straight lines, but in flowing paths, encouraging a slower pace because the space itself does not allow for speed. The narrowness of the canyon creates a sense of enclosure. The sky is visible only in thin lines above, light entering in limited ways, which makes every beam more noticeable, more defined. The scale of the canyon is not overwhelming in width, but it is in height. Walls rising above, creating vertical space that contrasts with the narrow ground below, and that contrast adds impact because it changes perception. The texture of the stone varies across the surface, some areas smooth, others showing subtle ridges, indicating the different ways water has interacted with the rock over time. The colours of the canyon are not uniform. They shift depending on depth, light and angle, creating layers of tone that add complexity to what might otherwise appear simple. The presence of light beams transforms the space entirely, because they introduce a temporary structure, lines of light that exist for a moment, then disappear. And that temporary nature matters, because it means the canyon is never exactly the same twice, each moment slightly different, each view changing with time. The relationship between light and stone defines the experience, because neither element alone creates the effect. It is their interaction that produces something unique. The canyon itself does not explain this, it simply exists, allowing conditions to align in a way that produces these visual effects. The durability of the stone ensures that the structure remains, even as water continues to shape it slowly, even as time continues to pass. But the light is always temporary, appearing only under specific conditions at specific times, and that balance creates something unusual, a permanent structure defined by a temporary phenomenon. Even now, Antelope Canyon remains, its walls still shaped by the same processes, its form still intact, its light still moving through the same openings. What defines this place is not just its formation, but its interaction with light. A canyon that does not simply exist as stone, but as a space where light becomes visible. A structure formed by water, but revealed by sunlight. A place where movement is not just physical, but visual. And maybe that is what makes it stand out, not because it is large, but because it transforms something invisible into something that can be seen. Light shaped by space, stone shaped by time, a passage where both come together, and that moment, the headdress that turned a human into something else, Starcar. At first, it doesn't look like clothing, not in the way we understand it today. It's heavier, more rigid, and shaped from something that once belonged to an animal. Antlers. This is the Starcar headdress. Discovered in England, preserved in wetland conditions that allowed organic materials to survive far longer than they normally would. And what makes it stand out is not just what it's made from, but how it was used. The structure is built from a deer skull, not a replica, not carved from stone, but an actual skull, modified, carefully shaped so it could be worn. The antlers remain attached, extending upward, creating a silhouette that is immediately recognizable, but no longer fully human. The interior of the skull shows signs of alteration, hollowed, adjusted, so that it could fit over a person's head, which means this was not a symbolic object left untouched. It was functional, it was worn, and that changes how it is understood. Because this is not just an artifact, it is something that transformed the person wearing it. When placed on the head, the form shifts completely. The human outline disappears, replaced by something else, something that blends human and animal. And that transformation is important, because it suggests intention beyond practicality. This was not protection, not simple decoration, it was representation. The effort required to create this headdress would have been significant. The skull had to be cleaned, prepared, openings made carefully, without breaking the structure. Antlers are dense, difficult to modify, and yet the shape was preserved, which suggests control, precision. The environment of Starcar played a role in its preservation. Wet conditions slowed decay, allowing materials like bone and antler to remain intact over thousands of years. And because of that, this object still exists, still holds its form, still shows the modifications that were made. The presence of multiple headdresses at the site adds another layer, because this was not a single isolated object, it was repeated, which suggests that the idea behind it was shared, not random, not experimental, but part of a practice. The purpose of these headdresses is not fully defined. Some interpretations suggest ritual use, worn during specific activities, ceremonies, hunting rituals, moments where identity may have shifted, because wearing something like this changes perception, not just for the person wearing it, but for anyone seeing it. The human becomes less recognizable, the animal form becomes dominant, and that shift creates meaning. It suggests connection between human and animal, between observer and environment. Other interpretations suggest practical use in hunting, blending into surroundings, reducing recognition by animals. But even within that explanation, the level of modification suggests something more. Because this is not minimal, it is complete. The scale of the antlers adds presence, extending above the head, creating height, making the figure more visible, not less, which makes concealment less likely, and symbolic transformation more likely. The wear patterns on the headdresses indicate use, not just creation. They were handled, worn over time, which means they were part of repeated activity, not a one-time object. The relationship between the headdress and the person wearing it is central, because the object alone is incomplete. It requires a human form to become what it was intended to be. And that interaction defines it. Even now, the star-car headdresses remain some of the clearest examples of early human modification of identity through objects. Not just tools, not just decoration, but transformation. What makes this artifact stand out is not just its age, but its purpose. A human wearing an animal form, not partially, but fully. A shift in appearance. That suggests a shift in role, a design that goes beyond function into meaning. And maybe that is what makes it so difficult to fully explain, because it does not fit into a single category. It is not just clothing, not just a tool, not just symbolic. It is all of them, at once. A structure made to be worn, a form made to change identity, a presence that alters perception, a human becoming something else, and that transformation, the temple, where answers were given without explanation. Siwa Oracle. Far from the main flow of the Nile, beyond the dense concentration of monuments and cities that define much of ancient Egypt, there is a place where the landscape begins to thin out. The terrain opens, sand stretches further, settlements become distant, and what remains is a quiet, isolated region, centered around water that should not be there. This is the Siwa Oasis, a place that exists within the desert, sustained by underground sources, creating an environment where life continues despite the surrounding emptiness. And within this isolated setting, there is a structure that once held a very different kind of importance. The Temple of the Oracle, not the largest structure, not the most visually dominant, but one that carried influence far beyond its size. At first, the remains of the temple appear simple: stone walls, partial structures, fragments of what was once a complete space. But the significance of this place does not come from its physical scale. It comes from what happened here. Because this was not just a temple for ritual offerings or traditional worship. It was a place where questions were brought and answers were given. The concept of an oracle is different from standard religious practice. It is not about repeating known rituals. It is about seeking something unknown, a response, a direction, something that cannot be determined through ordinary means. And that is what defined this site. People travelled across long distances to reach it, not for spectacle, not for architecture, but for answers. The isolation of Siwa plays a role in this, because distance creates separation. It removes the site from everyday life, and that separation adds weight to the experience. Reaching the temple was not immediate. It required effort, movement across desert terrain, time, and that journey itself becomes part of the process. The structure of the temple suggests controlled access, not fully open, not entirely exposed, but arranged in a way that guides movement inward, from outer space into a more enclosed interior. And that transition matters because it creates a shift from the outside world into a more focused environment. The materials used in the temple are consistent with the region, stone-shaped and placed to create stable forms, walls that define space, openings that allow limited light. The interior would not have been brightly lit. Instead, it would rely on controlled light, entering in small amounts, creating shadows, defining areas, And that atmosphere changes perception. Because limited visibility focuses attention, it reduces distraction, it creates a sense of depth within a confined space. The process of receiving an answer from the oracle is not fully documented in detail, but what is known suggests that it was not direct in the way we expect today. The responses were not always clear, not always immediate, and often open to interpretation, which introduces a different kind of understanding, because the answer itself is not always the final point. It is how the answer is interpreted that gives it meaning. The presence of the oracle attracted individuals of high status, leaders, figures of influence, people whose decisions affected large groups, and that changes the role of the temple, because it becomes more than a local site, it becomes a place of decision. One of the most notable aspects is the connection between this site and figures who travelled specifically to consult it, because the distance alone suggests importance. No one travels across desert terrain without purpose, without expectation, and that expectation shapes the experience, because by the time the individual arrives, the moment already carries weight. The environment surrounding the temple contributes to its impact. The silence of the desert, the absence of constant movement, everything feels slowed, reduced, and within that stillness, the act of asking a question becomes more focused. The structure itself does not reveal how answers were given. It does not explain the process, it simply provides the space. And that absence of clarity is important, because it leaves room for interpretation. The durability of the temple allows it to remain. Even as time alters its form, even as sections are lost, the core structure still exists, still marks the location, still connects the present to the past. The relationship between the temple and the oasis creates contrast, because water and vegetation exist alongside stone and sand, life and structure, movement and stillness, and that contrast adds another layer to the experience. Even now the site remains, not as it once was, but enough to understand its presence. What defines the Siwa Oracle is not just the structure, it is the function, a place where people came seeking something they could not find elsewhere. Not certainty, but guidance. A space where questions were brought into silence, and answers emerged, without full explanation. And maybe that is what makes it stand out, not because of what it shows, but because of what it does not reveal. A temple that does not explain its process, a structure that does not define its answers, only a place, a space, where something was asked, and something was given. The stone chamber, built to outlast its builders, Almeria Dolmen. In a dry landscape where the ground stretches in muted tones and the horizon feels distant, there are structures that don't rise upward, but sit low, almost hidden. At first, it's easy to miss. Just a mound, a slight elevation in the earth, nothing that immediately suggests design. But as you move closer, the shape begins to reveal intention. This is one of the dolmens of Almeria, part of a wider prehistoric landscape connected to Los Millares, where stone was arranged not to create height, but to create space within. And that distinction matters, because this is not a structure built to be seen from far away. It is a structure built to be entered. The dolmen consists of large vertical stones, placed upright, supporting horizontal slabs above them, creating a chamber, not carved from rock, but assembled. And that assembly is what defines it. Because each stone had to be selected, moved, positioned with precision. The weight of these stones is significant, far beyond what can be lifted casually, which means the process required coordination, multiple individuals, time, effort sustained over a period long enough to complete the structure. The entrance to the dolmen is narrow, a passage that leads inward, not wide, not open, but controlled. And that passage creates a transition, from outside into inside. The interior space is enclosed, stone on all sides, a ceiling formed by large slabs, creating a chamber that separates itself from the surrounding environment. Light enters only in limited ways. Small openings, the entrance itself, which means the interior is dim, quiet, and that environment changes perception, because enclosed spaces focus attention, they reduce distraction, they create a sense of stillness. The purpose of the dolmen is most often associated with burial, a place where bodies were placed, not individually, but sometimes collectively, and that suggests continuity. Because the structure was not used once, it was used over time. The placement of remains within the chamber would have followed patterns, arrangements that reflected cultural practices. Though not all of those practices are fully preserved, the presence of multiple dolmens in the region adds another layer, because this is not a single structure. It is part of a network, similar forms, similar construction, repeated across the landscape, and that repetition suggests shared knowledge, a method that was understood, a design that was replicated. The alignment of some dolmens indicates awareness of direction, entrances positioned in specific orientations, possibly connected to light, to seasonal changes. Though the exact intention behind these alignments is not fully confirmed, the materials used are local, stone gathered from the surrounding area, shaped minimally, placed with intention, which means the focus was not on altering the material extensively, but on positioning it correctly. The durability of the structure allows it to remain, even after thousands of years, even as the surrounding environment changes. The mound that often covers the dolmen adds another layer, because it conceals the chamber. From the outside, it appears simple, but inside, there is space, and that contrast is important, because it separates appearance from structure. The effort required to build such a chamber suggests that it held significance, not just as a practical space, but as a meaningful one, a place connected to memory, to continuity, to the idea of preserving something beyond the immediate present. The scale of the stones contributes to that sense, because large materials create permanence, they resist change, and that resistance is part of the design. Even now the dolmen remains, its stones still standing, its chamber still defined, not complete in the way it once was, but enough to understand its form. The silence inside such a structure is noticeable, because the enclosure isolates sound, creates stillness, and that stillness adds to the experience. What defines the Almeria dolmen is not complexity, but intention, a structure built from simple elements, stone, space, alignment, but arranged in a way that creates meaning, a chamber beneath the earth, a space hidden from view, a place designed to hold, not just bodies, but presence, and maybe that is what makes it stand out. Not because it dominates the landscape, but because it exists within it, quiet, enclosed, enduring, a structure that does not demand attention, but remains. Stone placed with purpose, space created with care, a chamber that continues to exist, long after those who built it are gone. The pyramids that stand closer, steeper and still unanswered, Meroe. Far from the Nile's main centres of ancient Egypt, deeper into the desert landscape of Sudan, there is a place where the horizon begins to fill with shapes that feel familiar, but not quite the same. At first, they resemble pyramids, angular, geometric, recognizable in form. But as you move closer, the differences become clear. This is Meroe, a site where dozens of pyramids rise from the desert, not spread far apart, but grouped together in a way that feels dense, almost clustered, and that arrangement immediately sets them apart. Unlike the large, widely spaced pyramids of Giza, these structures stand closer to each other, side by side, forming a landscape of repeating shapes. The scale is different. Each pyramid is smaller in base compared to those in Egypt, but steeper. The angles rise more sharply, creating a vertical emphasis that changes how the structure is perceived. And that change matters, because it shifts the visual experience. The pyramids of Meroe were built as burial structures, associated with the kingdom of Kush, a civilization that developed alongside and sometimes in connection with ancient Egypt, but with its own distinct identity. This distinction is important, because while the form of the pyramid appears similar, the context is not identical. The construction of these pyramids reflects adaptation. Stone blocks arranged to create the outer structure, internal chambers designed to hold remains and associated objects. But the entrances are different. Rather than entering from high points within the structure, many of these pyramids have entrances at ground level, often leading into small chapels attached to the front, and that changes how the structure is used, because the interaction with the pyramid happens from the outside first, before moving inward. The chapels themselves contain carvings and inscriptions, reliefs that show figures, scenes, symbols, and these carvings provide some of the clearest insight into the beliefs of the people who built them. The environment surrounding Meroe plays a role in how the site is experienced. Desert stretching outward, sand moving over time, the pyramids rise from this landscape not as isolated monuments, but as a collective presence. The repetition of the structures creates rhythm, a pattern across the terrain, and that pattern adds impact, because a single pyramid is significant, but dozens together create something else. The effort required to construct these pyramids would have been substantial. Stone transported, positioned, aligned to maintain the structure. Even at a smaller scale compared to larger pyramids, the coordination needed remains significant. The steep angles of the pyramids create a different visual dynamic. They appear taller than they are, more pointed, which changes how light interacts with the surface. Shadows forming more sharply, edges becoming more defined. The preservation of the pyramids varies. Some remain relatively intact, others are partially collapsed, but even in incomplete form, the overall layout remains visible, and that visibility allows the site to be understood as a whole. The purpose of these pyramids is tied to burial and the afterlife. Structures meant to last beyond a single lifetime, and that intention is reflected in the materials: stone chosen for durability, arrangement designed for stability. The relationship between the pyramids and the desert creates contrast, because the environment is constantly shifting, while the structures remain. Sand moves, covers, reveals, but the core forms persist. The alignment of the pyramids suggests planning, not random placement, but organized distribution, possibly reflecting hierarchy. Order, though not all of these patterns are fully understood. The site of Meroe represents a continuation of an idea, rather than a direct copy. The pyramid form adapted, changed, maintained in concept, but altered in execution, and that evolution matters, because it shows that structures are not static, they develop. Even now the pyramids of Meroe stand, their shapes still recognizable, their arrangement still visible, not untouched, not unchanged, but present. What defines this site is not just the structures themselves, but how many there are. A field of pyramids, not one, not a few, but many, repeating the same idea across space. And that repetition creates something different. A landscape defined by structure, a horizon shaped by geometry, a place where the pyramid is not singular, but collective. And maybe that is what makes Meroe stand out, not because it copies what came before, but because it transforms it. A familiar form, repeated in a new way, a structure adapted to a different context, stone rising from sand, shapes aligned across distance, a field of pyramids that continues to stand. The civilization that didn't fall, but slowly disappeared, Indus Valley. At first it looks like a complete system, organized, structured, planned in a way that suggests long-term stability. Cities built with intention, streets laid out in grids, drainage systems that still function in concept even today, and for a time, it worked. This is the Indus Valley civilization, one of the earliest large-scale urban societies spread across what is now Pakistan and northwest India. And what makes it stand out is not just how advanced it became, but how it ended. Because unlike many other ancient civilizations, there is no clear moment of collapse, no single event, no visible destruction across all sites. Instead, something else happened, something slower. At its peak, the civilization was extensive. Cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were not isolated. They were part of a network, connected by trade, shared systems, common design principles. The layout of these cities reflects planning. Streets arranged in straight lines, intersections forming right angles, buildings constructed with standardized bricks, uniform in size, consistent in structure, and that consistency matters, because it shows coordination, not random growth, but organized expansion. The drainage systems are one of the most striking features. Channels running alongside streets, wastewater directed away from living areas, covered drains, access points for maintenance, a level of infrastructure that suggests not just functionality, but foresight. Water management was central. Wells, reservoirs, systems designed to store and distribute water, which indicates understanding of environment. The presence of trade extends beyond the region. artifacts found that connect the Indus Valley to distant areas, goods moving, ideas possibly moving with them, and that interaction adds complexity, because it shows that the civilization was not isolated. The writing system remains one of the unresolved aspects. Symbols carved onto seals, repeated patterns, but not fully deciphered, which means that a significant part of their communication remains unknown, and that gap matters, because without it, understanding is incomplete. At some point, changes begin to appear. Gradual, not immediate. Urban centres begin to shift. Some areas show signs of decline, not destruction, but reduction. The population seems to disperse, moving away from large cities. Settlements become smaller, less dense, and that transition suggests movement. Environmental factors are often considered. Changes in river patterns, the Indus River and its tributaries shifting course, water sources becoming less reliable, and that change would affect everything. Agriculture, settlement, sustainability, because a civilization built around water depends on its stability. Climate may also have played a role. Gradual changes in rainfall, not sudden, but enough to alter conditions over time, and that slow shift aligns with a pattern of decline, not collapse, but transition. The absence of widespread evidence of conflict is notable. No clear signs of large-scale invasion, no consistent destruction layers across major sites, which separates this from many other collapses, because it suggests that the end was not caused by a single external force, but by a combination of factors: internal adaptation, environmental change, movement of populations. The artifacts that remain show continuity, styles that evolve rather than disappear completely, which suggests that the people did not vanish, they moved, adapted. But the large urban system did not continue in the same form. The infrastructure that once defined the civilization becomes less prominent. The standardized construction reduces. The organized grid systems become less consistent, and that shift marks the transition. Even now the sites remain, excavated, studied, providing insight into how the civilization functioned, but not fully explaining why it changed. What defines the Indus Valley is not just its development, but its ending. A civilization that reached a high level of organization, without a clear, singular moment of collapse. Instead, a gradual transformation, cities emptying, systems fading, structures remaining, but no longer used in the same way. And that makes it different, because it challenges the idea of collapse as a single event. It suggests that civilizations can change without breaking, that they can dissolve into something else, a network that slowly spreads out, a system that loses its center. And maybe that is what makes it so difficult to fully define. Not a fall, not a destruction, but a disappearance. That happened slowly enough and to leave almost no clear boundary. A civilization that did not end in a single moment, but faded. And that quiet transition. The circle that measured the sky before history recorded it, Gosek. In a quiet landscape where fields stretch across the horizon, and the terrain feels unchanged for long distances, there are patterns that don't immediately reveal themselves. From the ground, it looks ordinary. Open land, flat, continuous. Nothing that suggests a structure of significance. But from above, the shape appears. A circle, defined, precise, not natural. This is the Gosek Circle, located in Germany, considered one of the earliest known circular enclosures connected to observation of the sky. And what makes it stand out is not just its age, but its alignment. The structure is formed by a series of concentric rings, ditches, palisades, entrances cut into the circle at specific points. These elements create boundaries, layers that define space, not just a single circle, but multiple rings working together. The scale of the structure is significant, large enough to be visible clearly from above, yet subtle enough at ground level to blend into the landscape, and that contrast matters, because it hides complexity. The entrances to the circle are not randomly placed. They are aligned, carefully positioned to correspond with specific points on the horizon, particularly the sunrise and sunset during the winter solstice. And that alignment changes how the structure is understood, because it connects the earth to the sky. The process of constructing such a structure would have required coordination, measuring direction, marking positions, creating a circular form that maintained symmetry. The materials used were simple: earth, wood. But the arrangement was not simple. It required planning. Because even a small deviation in alignment would alter the relationship with the sun. And that precision suggests knowledge, an understanding of movement, not of objects on the ground, but of the sun across the horizon. The experience of standing within the circle would have been different from observing it from above. Because the structure encloses space, it creates a boundary, separates inside from outside, and within that space, the view is controlled. Looking outward through the entrances, the alignment becomes visible, the sun appearing exactly where the structure allows it to be seen, and that moment defines the purpose, not constant, not every day, but specific, occurring at particular times of the year, which means the structure is not just spatial, it is temporal, it marks time. The repetition of this observation would have created cycles, patterns that could be tracked, which introduces the idea of measurement, not in units, but in events, the rising and setting of the sun at specific points. The durability of the earthworks allows traces of the structure to remain, even after thousands of years. The wooden elements no longer exist, but their positions can be inferred, reconstructed through the patterns left behind, and that reconstruction allows the structure to be understood again. The relationship between the circle and the surrounding landscape is subtle, because nothing else in the immediate area dominates, which means the structure defines its own presence. The purpose of the Gossec circle is often associated with early astronomical observation, but the full context of its use is not completely known, because observation alone does not explain everything. There may have been ritual elements, gatherings, events tied to the moments marked by the structure, and that possibility adds another layer, because it connects function with meaning. Even now the site remains, not fully intact, not fully visible, but present, its shape still traceable, its alignment still measurable. What defines the Gossec circle is not height, not mass, but precision. A structure built not to rise above the land, but to define it. A circle that frames the horizon, an arrangement that turns movement of the sun into something visible. A place where time is not counted, but observed. And maybe that is what makes it stand out. Not because of what it shows at every moment, but because of what it reveals at the right moment. A circle drawn into the earth, entrances aligned with light. A structure that does not move, but measures what does.